in this session of the Scottish Affairs Committee, and I should mention that we have a guest this morning in Tom Rutland, who's a member of the DCMS Committee and who's here today because of the session that we're having. So welcome, Tom. And welcome to our guests this morning too. It's really good to have you along, and we're really looking forward to having this discussion with you this morning. So again, thank you for coming, and congratulations to Hayley in her new position. Well, relatively new position.
Relatively new, yeah.
I'm sure it probably feels as though you've been there forever now, but...
No, still quite new.
Oh, well, good. We're getting you when you're very, very new. That's good. Okay. Can I just ask each of you to introduce yourselves briefly for us, please? That'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Matingwa, Smisha Myrit Mali Buruch. Good morning. I'm Margaret Mary Murray. I'm responsible for the BBC's Gaelic language services, which are BBC Alba, which we run in partnership with MG Alba and BBC Region Gael.
Morning, I'm Hayley Valentine. I'm the new director for BBC Scotland. I've been in post for almost 2 months.
Good morning, I'm Louise Thornton. I'm the head of commissioning for BBC Scotland, sitting across TV, radio, iPlayer.
Thank you. It's very helpful to know. I'm going to begin with some questions this morning. So, given that we're at the start of a new year, it seems appropriate to ask what your priorities are for the year ahead. And I suppose this is really directed to Hayley. And what your long-term ambitions for BBC Scotland under your leadership will be.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to start with a sort of overview of the BBC's ambitions all together, and kind of how they knit together with BBC Scotland's ambitions, because clearly we're in total alignment on those and they feel really relevant for audiences in Scotland. We are very content focused and we're very, very audience focused. The 3 pillars of the BBC's content strategy is pursuing truth with no agenda, so that's largely about our news coverage. And it's crucially important to me that in Scotland we get that right, that we are, a trusted source of news in a world where that's not always the case, that we really deliver on our news values, that we look at in investigations, in policy, and all of those big areas of Scotland that we know that our audience really cares about. Furthermore, we're going to invest in homegrown storytelling. So in a Scottish context, that looks like the big dramas that we're commissioning, but it's also in factual, it's also in comedy across the whole commissioning piece, both in Gaelic and in English. And we've got some really big ambitions in that area. And the third thing that the BBC is really plays a massive role, I think, in is bringing people together. So those big events, and in Scotland that comes across big sporting events. We know that Scotland really cares about sport. Our big cultural events, which we really distinctive in our coverage, that we're doing them in a way that nobody else is doing. The big festivals, the big Scottish moments. So all of those things really knit together as the BBC's ambitions as a whole, but I think Scotland has a really big role to play in all of that, and I've got some big ambitions in that area. And if you'll bear with me, you talked about priorities, and the priorities that I've asked the staff, I've done a couple of big staff events, there's 4 priorities that I've asked them to think about over the next 12 months. We can talk a bit further ahead, but the next 12 months is really building that relationship with audiences in Scotland. And I think that comes through our content. I think, obviously we build relationships in lots of different ways. We do lots of the sort of stakeholder management. I do lots of that myself, but I think it's basically a content aspiration that, how do we make sure that our audiences are getting what they want from us? And we've got some really good evidence over the last 12 months of how we've done that, but I want to do more of it. But I think the BBC is changing, and what I really want to do is build more collaborations with other parts of the BBC and the rest of the industry. We can't operate alone. We're not in splendid isolation anymore. So, we can only deliver those really big, high-impact content pieces if we collaborate with others. And, my colleagues will talk more about how they're doing that, but we can no longer operate on our own, and nor would we want to. And not only do I want to demonstrate that, we are reflecting Scottish audiences back to themselves, but also I want Scotland to be reflected across the rest of the UK and the world. I want that sense that Scotland has stories to tell that are interesting and relevant to the whole of the UK and the whole of the world. My third priority, which is very timely, I think, is to build the case for the BBC. We're about to go into a conversation about the future of the BBC and what is Scotland's role in that conversation. What is the case for the BBC in Scotland as well as the whole of the UK. And then my 4th priority that I've asked people to really think about, and those who know me through previous roles know this already, but it's very, very important to me that we have a really positive, inclusive, creative culture. And that piece about is the BBC in Scotland the best place you can work in Scotland, whether you work for us or whether you work with us and alongside us? And I think culture is important to me, for all the obvious reasons. We want it to be a brilliant place to work. We want people to be able to be really positive about the place that they work. But it also impacts on content. They're not two separate things to me. I think, if you've got a great culture where people can feel that they can bring their most creative ideas and they can take some risks, I think that then impacts on the sort of content that we make. So those are my priorities. And then, we're doing this just to get a little bit of context against a backdrop where I think the BBC's place in public life in Scotland is more important than ever. I think we need to play a massive role in that. And I think, we are working against quite challenging financial constraints. The financial position is not easy for us to manage. We have some difficult choices to make. But I think there's also a real opportunity there. The BBC plays a really big role in the creative sector in Scotland. We want to continue to do so.
Thanks very much. Hayley, can I ask you, where do you think BBC Scotland is doing well, and where would you like to see it improve?
So I think it's doing well in so many areas. There's so much to be proud of. If you look at, we use many measures to think about what our audience wants, and we've got better data than we've ever had before. We've got lots of information about our audience. But one of the things we do is something called a For Me score. So do people think that we're for them? And, it's on the up, basically. And if you look at, we do it over a 6-month period. I haven't got the last 6 months of the year, but the first 6 months of 2024, we had a massive increase in our For Me scores internally. It's an internal measure. And I'd put it down to, that content piece. So, across the piece we had a general election, which we did brilliantly. I'm so proud. I wasn't there. I can't take any credit for any of this stuff, but we did a really, really good, both the campaign and the election night itself. I thought our election night was, arguably the best television on the night, and I do a lot of channel flicking, but I thought the Scotland offer was really, really strong. I think we've got a brilliant news team, particularly in the area of politics, who I think do a really, really good job for us. But it's more than that, because we're looking at broader audiences. The other things we had was some really, really strong drama, and the most important thing about it was some really strong Scottish representation. I think what people want from us is to see their lives reflected back. So we had Night Sleeper, which started in Glasgow. I heard somebody the other day saying that they loved the fact that it started at Central Station because they've been standing around there when trains have been delayed a lot. But that sense that we had a great Scottish cast in that and a Scottish placing of that drama. We also had Rebus, and then not forgetting the football. And I think one of the things we do best of all is our sports coverage. And at the Euros, all the commissioning we did around the football and the way in which we covered that tournament, those scores are not accidental. They're about our content. So I'd start there, and that's what we have to build on. I think the challenge for us is how we keep that going. We need a cadence of really high quality drama, high quality factual. Inside Berlin that we made last year was a real success for us. Really good comedy. We've had a few successes recently, which Louise will talk about in a bit more detail for you if you'd like that. But those big pieces where we represent the audience well, and when we do our news coverage particularly well, and when we get our sport right, I think those are the sort of central planks of where we need to build.
Are there any lessons from your previous work in the BBC that you want to take forward in this role now that you have that opportunity?
There are lessons every day in this job, and there's every day is a school day in this job. Of course, I've worked in politics for a long time. I've worked in the network newsroom. I spent 3 of the last 4 years in the network newsroom. And I've worked in English regions, and I think you always learn something from all of these jobs. I think that working in network and in news was like every job I've had a massive learning curve. I've done it before, I've done it for a lot of my career, but going back into that role at a senior level, there's always something to learn. I think probably, if I'm honest, the most recent lessons have come from my time in the Midlands, where we operate in English regions with relatively slim resources, and what we managed to achieve with that is pretty impressive. I had almost as big an audience base working in the Midlands as I do in Scotland. It's a very different cultural mix, obviously, and I've learned a lot from working there. But what we can achieve with the right people facing in the right direction with the right strategy, I think that there's a lot to learn from the English regions.
Can I ask a question based on that?
Yeah, briefly, if you would, Angus.
So I'm a huge listener to BBC Scotland radio, and I absolutely adore it. And like almost everybody I know, we all look at the BBC website for news. And I wonder about productivity. So I was in the news world for a decade. But if you look at the Highlands and Islands, there's very often only one story a day. or if you look at business in Scotland, there's very few, 3 or 4 stories. And I wonder if you consider the productivity of your team in terms of churning out stories and benchmark it against the other media, because I think it might be something worth looking at.
I mean, we'll always look at everything, clearly. I think that we need to focus on quality. So, your phrase churning out stories is an interesting one. What some of our competitors are looking at volume because they have other priorities around, engagement of advertisers, etc. And we are really looking at quality. So, I think our resourcing is slimmer than it's ever been, frankly. But I think that we do well to cover the country, particularly you're talking about the Highlands. I think we offer that representation of stories, and we operate, particularly you talked about radio and online, we operate a structure which is story-based now. So we don't have separate journalists doing things for radio, television and digital. That's not the way that we operate. We have story teams. It's based on a network model that we ran in London as well. But what happens is that journalists will be deployed on a story, or ideally they'll bring the story. They're brilliant at bringing stories, our journalists, and we do a lot of exclusive journalism, and they will do it for all platforms. So you will have heard a story on Good Morning Scotland, you will see a written piece by the same journalist most of the time, and a piece for television. And we find that clearly is a much more kind of productive way of working, that the one journalist takes ownership of a story and does it across platform. And I'll come back to the audience, that I think that our job is to make sure that wherever you choose to consume your news, we are pushing those stories out to you. It's our job to be there to meet you as your habits change, whether you're on digital or whether you're primarily a radio listener, or whether you sit and watch the 6:30 in the evening.
Okay, thank you. Elaine, I think you've got the next question.
Thanks for coming along today. This is for Louise and Margaret. The work that yourselves and the team do, how does this contribute to the BBC's purpose and objectives in Scotland?
Start that. Everything we do is for the BBC's purpose, so to inform, educate and entertain. I manage a commissioning team that sits across the platforms, so across TV, iPlayer, radio, sounds, and my team work across all the what we would call the genres of programme making, so unscripted and scripted, so that's factual, documentary, entertainment, comedy, drama, and increasingly we're delivering a lot more online as well, to Hayley's point about digital being our priority. So in terms of going where the audience is going, one of my big strategic aims is to grow iPlayer and to make sure that we have a universal service and a universal offering for audiences in Scotland where they can see and hear themselves represented. So in terms of iPlayer, our growth strategy is fantastic, so that's where I'm absolutely delivering on the BBC's strategy. Since channel launch, iPlayer for Scotland content's grown about 250%. I just love that stat. That really shows that what the team are doing and what the industry in Scotland and the UK are delivering for audiences in Scotland is really, really working. And then beyond iPlayer, our growth in terms of sounds as well is incredible. I think we've got about a 17% increase in on-demand on sound year on year. So that's, again, down to the fact that we've got live listening increasing on sound for about 14%, but actually the podcast strategy, where we can reach a much wider audience as well, is just delivering on that purpose of a broad audience within Scotland where they can see and hear themselves. And then within our online products as well, we have, I just can't say enough good things about the team that run Bite Size, really delivering on that education strategy. And the team that work on Bite Size don't just deliver the online pages that you will see, they also do live events with schools, they do outreach, they run a brand called Authors Live, where they bring in brilliant writing talent into the BBC in front of school children, and we put that on iPlayer. So it's really it's a very broad job that I have, but at each point within my commissioning team, we are always thinking, first of all, what audience are we hitting with this programme? Can we get value for money for the licence fee payer? And what is the best way to reach that audience in terms of the platform that we're using?
And just picking up on Louise's point, our Gaelic services do virtually everything that our English language services do, but through the prism of the Gaelic language. Our services on television and on radio, and increasingly on the digital platforms, aim to offer a credible and relevant service to Gaelic speakers and learners, but also offer a window or a door to the Gaelic language and culture to non-speakers. So I think we try and meet the aspirations of both of these audience poles, and we know that our audiences use the services in different ways. So in order to reach out to non-Gaelic speakers, our content, our documentary, our music and our sport content is really attractive. You don't need to have high levels of fluency to enjoy that content, and it's incredibly popular. But for our core audience, our news services is a big driver. And to Mr MacDonald's point about ensuring that stories from the Highlands and Islands are surfaced elsewhere in the BBC, in our Inverness newsroom, the English language journalists and the Gaelic language journalists are working much better together and in a more coherent way than they ever have in order to ensure that stories from the Highlands and Islands are reflected in our digital products. So for our core audience, news, entertainment, events, things like drama and children's programmes are incredibly important to us. We have children's programmes on BBC Alaba every evening from 5 to 7, and we have a brand, a CBBC Alaba sub-brand from the main English language brands, if you like. And then following on from that, a learning zone every evening, and our collaboration around the new Speak Gaelic resource, which has again been a partnership endeavour between ourselves and MG Alaba, Bordna Gaelic and Solmor Ostig, has had a massive impact in terms of learning the language. We are ambitious for the Gaelic language, we're ambitious for our audience, and I think we punch well above our weight in creative terms and in terms of ambition. Partnership lies at the heart of BBC Alaba. It lies at the heart of the way that we work, both organisationally and structurally, but also we partner well within the BBC and with other agencies and creative organisations, both in the UK, in Europe and increasingly worldwide.
Thanks, and just to be following on to that, so I expect you'll always be looking forward, and Hayley kind of gave the 4 themes there, but what are your priorities for 2025 and beyond?
The priorities for me and my team are to continue on that iPlayer and Sounds growth trajectory. They are to launch some. I mean, we're in the hits business. We want some big hits from Scotland, quite frankly. So I'm very excited about some of the programmes that we've got coming up. And to Margaret Mary's point, some of these programmes that we're commissioning are also commissioned in partnership with other international organisations. So, I mean, you never want to call out too many programmes, you don't want to leave anyone out, but we've got the return of Dinosaur coming back for a second series, and that's co-funded with Hulu. It's a fantastic Scottish comedy fronted by Ashley Storey, who we've worked with for years, part of, us working with new talent, and just to see her at the front of a big show like that will not just be shown Scotland, UK, co-commissioned with Network Comedy, but also across in America with Hulu. Those kind of things feel really exciting, and to Hayley's strategy point about Scotland to the world, we just want to do more things like that. So got quite a few examples of shows like that. Hopefully you'll all enjoy, that won't just be seen by audiences in the UK, but will be good Scottish portrayal going worldwide, and Margaret Mary's got a fantastic example of that as well.
Yes, a date for everybody's diary. 14th of January, BBC Alaba is launching our first ever high-end drama series in Chelan, the island.
You've seen it.
Oh, have you seen it?
You've got a preview.
Oh,
well. We were all so excited, I can't tell you. We couldn't tear ourselves away.
We were all intrigued because the trailer stopped at Really a cliffhanger. So I think you've got a bit of a captive audience already for that one.
So that's a really big thing for us.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask a follow-up question on that one?
Lillian's coming in first.
Douglas, I'm happy to pass to you if it's particularly on that point. I've got a point about BBC iPlayer.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. So just on the BBC iPlayer, I'm a fan of BBC iPlayer. In fact, I always catch up on Traitor through BBC iPlayer, which I believe is made in Scotland or filmed in Scotland. But just on BBC iPlayer, and given that people have to subscribe to a TV licence, I'm just wondering if you're exploring any other possibilities for people to be able to access BBC iPlayer or run through subscription, because you have to then sign up for it, have an email address and log in certain circumstances. So I'm just wondering if in the future or even now you're exploring these opportunities.
We are encouraging people to log in because it allows us to give people a more personalised experience. But to the wider point round about subscription based, that's part of a kind of charter renewal conversation, which I think Hayley, you might want to say.
I think what's really important, and you've probably heard the Chair's his first speech talk about this, that we need our service to feel universal, and if we have subscription services, then it excludes people who can't potentially afford that, the disenfranchised, the less well off. So our sense is that we make, we're content first, we make programmes, however you want to receive them, and when and where is increasingly a question. As you say, you presumably watch Traitors when it suits you better than when it's on live. We want to make that available to everyone. So, we're all about giving people the choice of when they consume our programmes, where they consume our programmes, but anything along the subscription model doesn't fit in with our kind of universal value of, the universality piece.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. On your priorities for the coming years, I've noted in your evidence that you've indicated that one of the three aims or objectives of BBC Scotland is to bring people together, and nothing brings people together like major sporting events, and I think you made reference to that, Hayley. What are your plans over the next couple of years? Will BBC Scotland be covering, for instance, the Commonwealth Games coming to Glasgow? And can I also ask you about our coverage of football? I think our coverage of the women's game in BBC Scotland is absolutely excellent, and that should be encouraged. What about Scotland's men's football team, free to air, available to everyone? You've just made reference to the less well-off in society not being able to afford subscription channels. Can that be available to everyone? Because that would bring the nation together.
It really would. Thanks for mentioning the women's football. I think we've done a brilliant job over the last few years, and I think we can take some credit for actually growing the game and growing the popularity of women's football, and I'm really proud of that, and more to the women on either side of me for making that happen. I know how important sport is to Scottish audiences. I'm a big football fan. These moments are huge for us, and of course we would love to have the men's internationals. These things are not cheap. And it is, we have to think about value for money in all of our decision making. In order to pay for one thing, there's no extra money. What are we not doing in order to fund something else? I don't really want to go much further than that because, as you can imagine, there are some kind of live discussions going on. But of course, I'd be delighted if we could bring those to free-to-air audiences. And you mentioned the Commonwealth Games. We will cover the Commonwealth Games. Again, there are conversations going on about rights, which I can't go into in this room. But if you look back at what we did the last time, I think that sense of how we cover sport as a whole, it's not just about the live match, or the live, the game. It's about what we do around the outside, and that sense of how we bring a city, a country together is really important to me. And I think our broad coverage of sport as well, we tell the stories of Scottish sport away from those live matches. I don't disagree at all about the importance of those moments, but we've told stories about the Andy Murray story, Doddy Weir. We've got a great documentary on Alex Ferguson at the moment. So that sense of how we deliver stories about Scottish sport to audiences is much wider than just the live events.
Very much. Before we pass on to the next question, which will be from Angus, can I just say you're all obviously really passionate about what you do. We have a lot of questions we want to ask. Could you maybe just keep the answers a tiny little bit shorter, and we'll try to be disciplined too. So thank you. Angus?
Do you get the impression that BBC Corporation appreciates BBC Scotland, and we get the share of the funding and support from the parent organisation?
Yes. In brevity, I really do.
Pay review coming up soon.
No. Yes, I mean, we spend, in the last year, we spent almost £300 million on content in Scotland. And increasingly, you know, across the UK project, the whole of the BBC is behind that. More and more content is coming to Scotland, is coming out of Scotland. More and more of the parts of network are based in Glasgow than ever before. And my sense is this is a BBC-wide mission. And the BBC has changed massively in the time that I've worked there since 1996. And that sense of where I sit within the BBC's sort of decision-making, conversation, influence is completely different, I think, than it probably was 20 years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you, Hayley. It's nice to be asking you the questions rather than to be on one of your shows where I'm the one being asked the yes. difficult questions. What a relief that is. Just in relation to following on from what's been asked there, it's still very much the case, as a report that came out last year emphasised, that much of the work which has been done in terms of reaching the quota for commissioning in Scotland actually derives from organisations that are actually based in London, essentially putting an office into Scotland in order to meet that quota. Do you believe that the BBC's ultimately ensuring that Scotland is benefiting in the way that it possibly should, because evidence would suggest there's a lot of work still to be done in that context?
Yeah, I'm going to apologise in advance because it's not a very short answer. The report that I think you're referring to, the Screen Scotland report, we work very closely with Screen Scotland, and their basic mission is to increase the creative sector and creative talent coming through Scotland, and we are totally aligned on that. But that particular report that they did only looked at things through one certain prism, which was they looked at the programmes through volume, number of programmes made, and their definition of what a Scottish company is was a company that has no parent company elsewhere. We work with a really broad range of production companies. We work with, I think, more than 70. And, you know, we will work with companies. Obviously, we support Indigenous Scottish companies that are absolutely based in Scotland. Of course we do. There are a number of companies which, you know, have a significant Scottish base but have a parent company elsewhere. You know, for example, you know, to my previous role, Mentorn. So Mentorn is part of a bigger company that's, I think, based in Wales. Mentorn has a significant base in Glasgow. You know, Question Time move into Glasgow was a big thing, and it has, you know, it gave me a career opportunity. It's given many people since then a career opportunity. I would argue that that is absolutely relevant, and there's nothing kind of odd about that being part of our quotas. It's given Scottish talent the opportunity to work on a really big network show. Since Mentor moved there, it's expanded. We now make debate night from Mentor as well, a really big part of that, you know, Scottish debate programming that we have. And I think, you know, there are other examples. For example, Landward, which has been made in Scotland for almost 50 years, made by BBC Studios. Under the way that report was put together, that wouldn't count. Now, you know, BBC Studios has a significant base both in Glasgow and in Aberdeen, but it clearly has a parent company, i.e. there's a base in London. So, you know, we work with people across a much wider range of definitions of what Scottish looks like than that particular report would have said. And the other thing I'd say is, you know, we are in the business of saying yes to expansion in Scotland. So there's a third example, which, you know, we will use, you know, an English-based company that wants to do work in Scotland because we are about supporting the sector overall. So, for example, we've got a production company at the moment which is based in England, has done several series of the programme for us in England and now wants to make one in Scotland. It will hire a significant number of freelancers in the industry in Scotland and support their careers. You know, we know how difficult the sector is at the moment. So our kind of base of what looks Scottish and what feels Scottish is much wider than that report necessarily defined. And the other thing to say about it, I say that volume piece, is that we, you know, make a lot of programmes that wouldn't have qualified in that report through volume. So things like Shetland, things like Question Time, because we don't make enough number of editions of those programmes to qualify. So, you know, it's not, you know, the report is valuable, and it's particularly valuable to Screen Scotland because of their key ambition, which we share, but we have a much wider range of definitions of how that works.
So thank you, Chair, and thank you, Hayley, for the answer there. in respect of Question Time, I understand the point that you're making. Of course, Question Time was a long-established show long before it moved to Scotland. It was essentially at the time lift and shift from the BBC in order to try and meet its quota requirements. I don't think there would probably be any disagreement in relation to that, but the success, certainly that's been there from the Scottish team, is to be commended and celebrated. But for every example like that, you've got a similar example, such as the World Snooker Championships, which is in Sheffield. I'm struggling to see how that's of huge benefit to anyone bar the BBC in terms of meeting its quota, because there doesn't seem to be any unique Scottish production value or creativity value deriving from that.
Again, a couple of things, and I'll try to be brief. The Sheffield example in particular, that is made by a Scottish production company. So, we follow the Ofcom guidelines as to what is Scottish. We try to, our ambition is to follow them on at least 2 of the 3 criteria, but one is that, it's a Scotland-based company that makes it. So, the Scotland-based company that makes it in Sheffield, because that's where the snooker is. So, it's one example. The broader picture is that on our quotas, we are doing much better than our quotas, both in terms of spend and in terms of what's the other one? Share. So, in terms of volume of stuff that we make. So, I would say that, there is the odd example like the Sheffield one, which you might think, that we're only meeting that criteria on one criteria. But broadly speaking, we are beating our quotas. We're making more content for more people in Scotland and giving more people jobs. And as I say, I think that overall, you can look at examples where we have Indigenous Scottish companies and which have parent companies that do good work in Scotland.
Very briefly.
Yeah, just one final question in relation to that. I appreciate your answer in that context. Of course, the likes of Question Time is a couple of hours long in terms of its runtime. Of that, with regards to the iPlayer and the crossover onto the BBC channel, the snooker show, for instance, would be thousands of hours, which all applies towards the same quota, despite the production value, of course, being slightly different and the number of people involved being slightly lower. So I'm struggling again to understand how that does anything but allow the BBC to meet its quota targets, as opposed to delivering genuine, good quality jobs and production value for a Scottish audience using Scottish people going forward.
So the quotas are for hours and for spend, and on hours we're doing a lot better than that 8%. So even if there are a volume of hours for the snooker, we're still way above what that quota would look like. And in terms of the jobs value, those bigger pieces, Question Time, but it's particularly things like the dramas, what Shetland has done in terms of 9 series of, hundreds of jobs to a part of the country, which probably had no media involvement at all before that, apart from the news that we do. It's very different from some of that high volume, lower spend end of things, which probably doesn't have as many jobs attached to it. So I would retain that, we are doing a lot of content which employs a lot of people, which, high value, high engagement jobs that I don't think was quite reflected in that report.
Thank you. Maureen.
Thank you. Thank you for coming along today. My question's directed to yourself, Hayley. Ofcom has found that positive impressions of the BBC are less common in Scotland than in some of the parts of the UK, including Wales and Northern Ireland. Why do you think this is the case?
We could sit here and kind of rehash, I think, why we think that we live increasingly in a polarised society, and that how that is a particular kind of tone in Scotland, which, the political situation in Scotland is unique. We've talked about football, that can polarise people. But I'm interested in what we do now, and clearly this is a challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity for me. And as I say, what we've been able to show in the last year is that if we get it right, that can change really quickly. So with those 4 Me scores, if we get the content right, if we deliver what we think people want, and it's not just our opinions, as I say, we now have a lot more data about what people want from us and what they're enjoying and what they want us to do more of. So the opportunity is there for us to improve on those scores, and the opportunity of us is to really serve the Scottish audience. And just touching on the politics, our approval ratings went up between the last 2 general elections. So 2019 and 2024, our approval ratings went up between the 2. So, I'm an optimist, but I do think there is a really positive case to make to say that if we get it right, we can improve those scores, and if we deliver for Scottish audiences, we can have a good relationship with them, and we can build on that.
Thank you. Just another caveat to the question. The BBC's income from licence-free payments in Scotland have been falling over recent years. Are you concerned that this may reflect declining engagement with the BBC among Scottish audiences?
I think, you know, it's really important to remember that people have more choice than ever now, and you know, it's our job to make sure that in that world we're giving people reasons to choose us. There are lots of reasons why people, you know, may not want to pay their licence fee, not least the cost of living crisis. But, you know, as I say, I think that if we can make that difference with the content, then we need to make the argument that we are worth people's money. You know, people have a lot of things to spend their money on. They have a lot of choice in terms of the media they consume. I mean, audiences in Scotland watch more television than any other part of the country. So there is a prize to win there. So, of course, it is a concern that people don't want to pay their licence fee, but it's our job to make sure that we're giving them good reasons why it's worth their money.
Thank you for that.
Elaine?
Morning. So I'd like to ask, BBC Scotland channel has been on air for 6 years now, but it's only been watched by 13% of Scottish adults, and viewing figures continue to decline. I'm just wondering, obviously you won't be happy with that performance, but what are you doing to try and claw that back?
So I was part of the commissioning team that launched the channel, and I think, you know, the way that obviously 6 years is a long time in the media landscape, especially with, you know, changing viewing habits. So we are in a world of linear decline. There's no denying that. The data tells us. Over the past couple of years, the performance of the Scotland channel has actually held steady. Now, I'm really proud of that, to be honest, because other channels are seeing sort of 6% decline, and I think we saw like 0.3 last year, which is like pretty even. But really, to be honest, in terms of a commissioning strategy, the channel is just one outlet for us to reach audiences. iPlayer has also changed a lot over those past 6 years. The prominence of Scottish content on iPlayer has improved massively. We now have a new and trending reel on the front of iPlayer. I don't know if you've seen it, but that first programme that you see in that new and trending reel, I hope, if you're based in Scotland, you should be seeing more Scottish prominence there, and we're getting more programmes on the front of iPlayer than ever. So while I still obsessively check the viewing figures for the BBC Scotland channel every morning, I can't deny it, I do, because it's still so important that we're out there. I'm really honing in on how we're doing on iPlayer. So those that, although the linear decline we're seeing is obviously a concern, but it's just a reality. The growth in iPlayer for me is offsetting that, and particularly for Scottish content. But then we do know what drives linear audience. I mean, like Hayley says, you know, audiences in Scotland do watch more telly than anyone. Live football performs brilliantly for us on the Scotland channel. New factual content like Inside Berlin, Highland Cops, you know, those kind of like premier launches that we can put on the channel that people still absolutely turn up for. Beechgrove, Landward, still driving massive linear audience. Obviously Debate Night, we've just launched a new news programme which started the channel really well on its first go. So we do know that we can get a linear audience, it's not our only focus. iPlayer is absolutely the future of where audiences are going. So we need to keep our eyes on the growth there.
So has the vision for what the channel should offer changed at all since it was launched?
I mean, I would say that when the channel launched, you know, it was so exciting, and we just had almost like a blank canvas, and so being part of that commissioning team was hugely exciting, and we were sort of jumping into the unknown. But I guess the sort of principles still remain. You know, we control a budget for Scotland, and it's all about reflecting Scotland's people back to them, to the rest of the UK, and to the world. So that's sort of those pillars of modern Scotland have not really changed. I guess looking at the content mix. My role in the commissioning team when we launched the channel was really about new talent and, you know, getting some of those kind of like new faces coming through, like Ashley's story that I mentioned, and you know, some of the kind of young talent that have gone on to present other things. I guess we're doing fewer low-cost hours, and that is part of the strategy of moving towards high impact. So some of the programmes that we would have commissioned at the start of the channel, generally in factual of the lower cost end, we're now diverting that money into big dramas. You know, we had Rebus, we've got two series of Granite Harbour, Mayflies. We've just had Only Child, which is the comedy that's just, you know, blown it out of the water over Christmas. I'm so pleased with that, but we wouldn't be able to invest in those higher impact pieces if we didn't stop doing the sort of like the lower cost, sort of like the middles being squeezed. But that is absolutely in a response to audience changes, to be quite honest, and that's what audiences are expecting from us, so that's what we need to deliver.
Just to Margaret, Mary, proportion of Gaelic speakers watching BBC Alba on average a week has fallen. I think the number that's been quoted here is 59% in 2020 to 46% last year. What do you think's went wrong, and how are we going to improve that?
Well, it's a similar story to what's happening globally. You know, people are consuming media in a different way, and BBC Alba is a linear TV channel. But it's incredibly important, as Louise was saying, that our content is manifested on digital platforms. The iPlayer is incredibly important to us. We also have our own YouTube channel as well, so it's really important that our Gaelic language content is available where the audience can consume it. So we have seen a decline in the linear channel, but we've also seen a 37% increase in iPlayer in our iPlayer stats. In fact, the last month, December, was our highest iPlayer performance ever. The last year has delivered over 7 million views to Gaelic content. So I'm increasingly confident that that people know and value the BBC Alba brand, and if they can find it on iPlayer and if they can find Gaelic content on Sounds, that they find content that will delight them and offer a window into our world. So yes, it's just that balance between the utility of a linear service, that daily habit in terms of news and children's programmes, but also ensuring that we have a window in digital as well.
Thank you.
Right, to follow up on that.
Thank you, Chair. And just, Louise, just come back to you for a second. 13% is a low figure. There's no denying that that's a low figure. And I understand what you're saying about sort of linear decline and that it's pretty much held steady. But you'd expect at 13% that's a pretty hard base. So that's a pretty committed base. You wouldn't expect that to change much. When BBC Scotland was commissioned, what sort of figure was the expectation? What was the pitch effectively? Where were you expecting it to be? And if it's not reached that, why has it not reached that figure?
I mean, I think it comes back to the fact that it was launched, 6 years ago, and linear viewing was much healthier 6 years ago. I mean, you can't underestimate the massive shift to
what was it at its peak?
I'd have to get back to you on that to give you the right figure. But we're not denying there's been decline. I think for us it's trend. We look at, if we're, and bearing in mind, the channel fluctuates from night to night as well. I mean, we can have an incredible night when in the morning we're looking at amazing figures. If we get like some live football games, just get hundreds of thousands of views, and then some programs that we think, like for example, I commissioned a program called The Agency Unfiltered, which is about young women who run this influencer business in Scotland, and it's a fantastic program. Really, young people actually seeing themselves in a positive light, in Scotland, and absolutely, that's one of my kind of key focuses, for people growing up in Scotland to have that. But it literally did nothing on linear, because that's not the audience on linear. The young audiences aren't watching those things on linear. It's all about iPlayer for that show, and I think when it launched, it had about over 80% of 16 to 34s watching it, but it was all on iPlayer. So I'm looking at the linear figures on the channel and thinking, well, that's not great. But then the iPlayer figures come in, and they don't just come in, they come in over like 28 days now. That's really when we're looking at shows. So nobody wants their channel or their shop window to be in decline, but we have to just recognise that it's against a declining market. The iPlayer figures, of growth of 29% year on year, if that wasn't happening, I'd be really concerned. But what I can't do is change our commissioning strategy to focus on linear when that's not where the audience is.
Thank you.
Douglas?
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Hayley. BBC Scotland's flagship news programme, The Nine, was cancelled at the end of last year, and I understand that you were the editor when it was launched originally back in 2019. So really what I want to ask you is, what had you hoped it would achieve at that stage? Did you consider at the time that was necessary when we already have Scottish news on BBC One Scotland, for instance, Reporting Scotland, and the other regular bulletins throughout the day in BBC One. The 9 has been replaced now, as I understand it, by a half-hour news programme, I think starting at 7 p.m, which immediately follows Reporting Scotland. Again, is that an unnecessary duplication? Is it effectively the same news being presented immediately after Reporting Scotland on BBC One, or will it be different? Is there a different take come 7 o'clock? What are you hoping to achieve from that, and will you be more successful in relation to viewing figures as a result?
Okay, so I'll start with the 9, and you're right, I was the launch editor of the 9. I started the role of planning for and then launching the 9 in 2017, which, back to Louise's point about linear audiences, was a long time ago. We had very different viewing habits in 2017 than we do now. But I will always be incredibly proud of what we did on the 9. We delivered the first television, obviously GMS has been doing it for years, and radio programmes, but the first integrated news programme in Scotland where you could watch all your local, national, UK-wide and international news in one place, all through the prism of what was relevant to and interesting to Scottish audiences. But beyond the programme itself, I think what it allowed us to do, and this is a part of that bigger picture of what the launch of the channel allowed us to do, was the influx of investment into Scotland at that point allowed us to hire in and develop a huge new swathe of talent, both at the sort of experienced end of the market. We brought James Cook back from America, we hired Martin Geisler from ITN, but we also brought in and developed a really diverse mix of younger reporters, producers from a really wide range of backgrounds, and many of them still work for us, but I'm equally proud of the ones that don't. We have a young director who joined us from local commercial television in England, who now directs the 6 and 10. One of our reporters who joined us from Radio T, having never done television, made a panorama at the end of last year. There are many, many stories of successes. A number of the people who work for me now work on big network brands. So, I will always be proud of that. But audiences change and habits change, and we have to move with them, as we've discussed. And what the money that cancelling the 9 has allowed us to do is not just launch that 7 o'clock programme, which I'll get to in a minute, but it's a whole suite of things that we've done. So, half-hour programme on the channel that reflecting, what audiences tell us we want is closer to what they've told us over the last few years that particularly the Scotland Channel audience wants. We're launching Scotcast, a podcast which starts next Monday. Martin Geisler will present it. I'm really keen that we're part of that cast brand. It feels like a real gap in the market. 4 days a week, news and current affairs through the Scottish prism. We know that as many people listen to podcasts in Scotland as listen to Radio Scotland, so we absolutely need to be in that place, and I'm really glad that we're doing that. We've invested more money in our digital news online. We want to be able to do more analysis, more in depth, to do more live pages, and to be more responsive at the weekend. So it's allowed us to do that in a really big growth area for us. We've also committed to doing a number of extended Reporting Scotland programmes. I've got my fingers so I don't forget one. Reporting Scotland programmes on really big days. We always did that with the 9, we did it with Reporting Scotland too, but when there are really big days for Scottish news, we'll extend that programme, make it longer, and do an hour of news where necessary. And finally, the money allowed us to do some extra editions of Debate Night last year, and really key moments during the general election. So it's not just about cancelling one programme and making another television. Back to audience habits, it's a real suite of programmes. And then the news at 7 it's kind of doing two things, and there's a balance. We know that the audiences on the channel like to see particularly Scottish stories reflected back from where they live and from the rest of Scotland. So we're really concentrating on that. Getting around Scotland, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch it yet. It's been on for 2 nights, but I'm guessing if you've been down here, you haven't had the chance to. But it's had a really strong start. We've got all the way around the country. We've done stories that perhaps wouldn't have appeared in other news output, from Inverness to Aberdeen to the borders. It's looking at things through the prism of the audience, so them telling their stories. So what you might get is a little bit of duplication across Reporting Scotland and the news at 7, but you might get the story done potentially from a policy and politics perspective on Reporting Scotland, and then the impact on real people maybe in the news at 7. So they can be watched in tandem, and you'll get a little bit of duplication in the stories. Not terribly much. Last night's lead story on the 7 had not been on Reporting Scotland. So, but you equally, for some people who come in at 7 who've missed that out of news, you'll get something fresh. But it's a really kind of warm, empathetic, through human stories take on the news, and I'm really pleased with it so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Thank you. Lillian, you're next up.
Thank you. So there was some research conducted by Ofcom in 2018 which found that viewers in Scotland felt less visible than any other viewers in other parts of the UK. I'm just wondering what has been done since then to address that issue, and is it still a challenge today?
So again, back to the strategy, and I'm trying to kind of look forward as opposed to look back, having just started the job, but this work has been done before I've got there, but we need to really push on with it, is that people want to see themselves reflected back across their output. So, the launch of the channel, all of its content, including the news that I've just talked about, was designed to make people feel more visible, to be able to see themselves reflected back. We know that that's what our audiences want, and that continues to be front and centre of our strategy. And we know that, for example, programmes over-index with audiences in the place where they're made. So if you can go right around the country, Highland Copse, Shetland, Landward, Rebus, across the country, there are really big examples of where programmes over-index with the audience in the place that they're made, but are really popular across Scotland, and they over-index in Scotland if they're network programmes as well. But, Louise, you might want to talk about your commissioning strategy, because it absolutely fits with this example of how we reflect audiences really well back to themselves.
It's something we take really seriously, and it's sort of, the channel is doing a lot in that space, and now obviously iPlayer. Ofcom actually did a piece of research, I think it was maybe 2022, that said that audiences who'd watched the BBC Scotland channel had a better view of the BBC. So there we feel that just plays into that strategy of people want to see and hear themselves reflected, and it's not just within the BBC Scotland channel. Actually, in terms of our co-commissioning strategy, and what I mean by that is we work very closely with our colleagues in Network BBC, who are commissioning for the whole of the UK. But we now have, honestly, in commissioning, we've never worked more closely together. And I can see just how much of kind of like the money that I control we are now spending in partnership with BBC Network to get bigger shows off the ground, so that don't just go on BBC Scotland channel or a BBC One opt-out slot, but will be on BBC One, will be on BBC Two, BBC Three, and that's really the audience data that we get shows us that these shows over-index in Scotland. So first of all, that's good. We're spending the money in the right way for audiences in Scotland, but we're also increasing our portrayal of Scotland throughout the UK, which is only a good thing as well. So Highland Copse is a great example. I don't know if you saw Confessions of a Teenage Fraudster, but that was a BBC Three co-commission with Scotland, telling a story of a young fraudster gone good. That over-index with audiences in Scotland, but also working class audiences as well, and that's another kind of key priority for us as a commissioning team.
Thank you. When I was reading my papers, I came across the minutes that was included within the papers from a meeting with the Scotland Committee from the 8th of May 2024, and that there was just something minted in. I appreciate that none of you were at that meeting. However, the committee noted how the phrase backing British content is better framed within Scotland as homegrown. Is that an approach to overcome perhaps the falling figures, the decline in some of the channels, do you agree with that approach?
Just so I understand the question, do I agree with the approach of backing homegrown creativity?
Yeah, this was the previous director from Scotland, and it's the Scotland report, and the committee noted how the phrase backing British content is better framed within Scotland as homegrown. And I just wondered if that was a better way of selling, promoting BBC Scotland rather than, from a British perspective.
I mean, I think, we commission, 9 out of 10 of the indies that we work with are from Scotland. I know there's the ONO report, but, we do have, in terms of a number of indies that we work with, it's about 90%. So we absolutely have a focus on, not to rewrite the BBC strategy, but we do have a focus on Scottish talent and Scottish production sector. So I guess that's maybe in reference to what the previous director was meaning there. In terms of the money that we've got, we tend to look for creatives within Scotland. It's fantastic. Richard Gadd won the Golden Globes, with his big Netflix show, but we're working with him for his next drama, which we're really excited about. He's a Scottish talent we've worked with for years, so that for us is a really good example of homegrown talent.
Mm-hmm. And I think just to your question about, the strategy which I started with includes, this is across the BBC, investing in homegrown storytelling is where we landed as the whole of the BBC. These strategies, you can imagine, are worked on, and the phraseology and how they quite align with audience needs is worked on for a long time. And, if you'll hear in other committees, no doubt, Tim Davey, etc., will talk about homegrown storytelling. I think it's a phrase that resonates with audiences in Scotland, but I think it's a phrase that resonates across the UK.
No further questions, thank you, Chair. Margaret Mary. During your time working at the BBC, have you seen a shift in the importance of the Gaelic content, and or is the prominence still given?
Within the organisation, I think the BBC, we celebrated last year, we celebrated the centenary of the BBC's relationship with Gaelic broadcasting. So the BBC and Gaelic go back a long, long way. The first Gaelic broadcast was a Gaelic sermon from Aberdeen. It was an audio broadcast, obviously. So the relationship is one of inclusion. It's been part of the BBC's portfolio. BBC Alba and Radio na Gael are proudly part of the BBC family. And I think we see our relationship with other BBC brands like the children's brands CBBC and CBBC. The drama that I spoke about earlier on is going out on BBC Alba, but also on BBC4. So I think the Gaelic language is absolutely a proud part of the BBC's portfolio. And I think the way that audiences can access other language content now has shifted, even in the last 5 years, and consumption on digital devices makes the audience much more familiar with consuming subtitled content. So I think that in itself, the language is not seen as a barrier to enjoying content in other languages. So I absolutely do feel that our Gaelic services are part of the BBC portfolio, and a proud part too.
Thank you. And looking back at last year when there was the partnership agreement with BBC and MG Alba, how will you assess the success of that, and what are the arrangements for it?
So the BBC and MG Alba formed a partnership in 2007, just before the channel was launched, and the chair will remember that time. So our partnership, the two organisations came together to deliver something unique. And we felt that this juncture in time when services are pivoting much more to digital, that we should look at all areas of the partnership, what both partners brought to audiences, and just what we've done is we've kind of recalibrated the partnership. I think it's much stronger. I think our partnership has always been strong, but having a focus on a digital future has allowed us to take a hard look at what the BBC can deliver and what MG Alba can deliver. So, for example, MG Alba's funding is largely pointed to the independent sector. I think about 97% of MG Alba's funding goes to the indie sector, and the BBC delivers core public service content such as news, education, children's, big music events such as the Mod, and also it's allowed the BBC to invest in again core public service areas. We've invested £250,000 in bite size. Learning and education is really important to us. We've invested in digital journalism, and we're investing in the co-development of great homegrown stories, working with our English language colleagues to develop more great bilingual drama. So that's what the review has allowed us to do, just examine what we do, ensure that our resources are pointing in the right direction, and ensure that we have content in the right places for audiences, and that we're as fleet of foot as we can be.
Thank you.
Yeah, Angus?
Thank you. I'm going to run my two questions together, and it's really about funding for the Gaelic programming, basically. And I know that there is a concern we don't have the same legislative protection for the Gaelic language as they do, for example, in Wales. And I wonder if you would like to comment about. I know John Morrison from MGM has said there's a real concern about funding for the Gaelic language. Are you comfortable that you're getting the funding that we need and we have the protection so we will not lose our Gaelic coverage?
I think from a BBC point of view, the funding for BBC Alba has incrementally increased over time from the launch in 2008 to the recent investment off the back of the partnership agreement. So I think there are funding challenges. It is a partnership, and our partners' funding has remained relatively stable during that period. But we are looking at the various mechanisms that can be deployed in order to ensure that we have a sufficient funding and legislative framework going forward. And again, our partners and ourselves work together on that. The BBC has increased its funding over time. Last year we invested in news and in journalism and in digital technology, for example, in Inverness. So the BBC's investment is sitting around about 10 million, and I think MG Alba's regular funding is sitting in the region of 12 million pounds at the moment.
You don't think we need legislative protection for the money spent on Gaelic programming like they do in Wales?
Well, I think within the media legislation, it's recognised. The Gaelic language is recognised, and again, I guess there is an opportunity to examine that with a forthcoming with a charter.
To Susan now.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to you all for coming. Well, I'm just wondering how Scotland has benefited from the BBC's Across the UK strategy in moving people and power and decision-making into Scotland. And you talked earlier about the collaboration that you're developing and how you think that will benefit. So I was just wondering how that actually meets the requirement to have more of the decision-making and the power in Scotland.
Yeah, so, the Across the UK project has, really transformed the BBC. In the last 10, 15 years, it's unrecognisable in terms of, where people sit and where decisions are made. And we have benefited from that so far. For example, there is a big network news department now sitting in Glasgow. We lead the technology story team with an on-air editor and a team of about 20 that sit in Glasgow that used to be based in London, and that's been a real success. We have, also people working in news growth and in iPlayer and other roles in news. So it is totally different than it was, as I say, 10, 15 years ago. And last year we set up a Scotland and Northern Ireland joint audio network unit based in Glasgow and a bit in Northern Ireland, and we make programmes out of Glasgow, including things like Loose Ends and Front Row from Glasgow, in a way that, again, all those programmes were previously based in London. So I think we've got to a really good place, and my message is always we are open for business. We would like more. We're really interested in what else could come out of Scotland, not just Glasgow, but out of Scotland. So that's the kind of broader picture of where we are with Across the UK. And as I say, I think that sense of how we collaborate, how we work together, the BBC feels like a really different place, and that sense of influence and opportunity to discuss, all of our needs in the context of Across the UK. And again, you'll have heard the Chair talk about this, that it's really important that project continues and that more work is done across the BBC and away from inside the M25, and we've been real beneficiaries of that so far. I think in a commissioning sense, We have, I'll let Louise talk about the detail, but we have 15 commissioners in Scotland, 5 of which are networked, 10 of which work for Scotland, and they all work really closely together. So that sense that the decision making happens in Glasgow between the two teams, with Network and Scotland working together, is again, a really different model than you might have seen a couple of decades ago. But I'll let you expand on that.
Yes, so in terms of where we sit right next to, my commissioning team sit right next to network commissioners who work across daytime, comedy, drama. So for example, the drama I referenced, Half Man, that's coming next year from Richard Gadd, who created Baby Reindeer, is commissioned between BBC Scotland and BBC Drama. So Lindsay Salt's the head of drama, I'm the head of commissioning in Scotland, and our 2 commissioners, Gaynor Holmes and Gavin Smith, they're co-commissioning that, and they're working hand in hand on that title. It's the same for Only Child. It's between Gavin and my team, and Gregor Sharp, who works to John, who's the head of comedy. So it's just never been so sort of collegiate, and that's all down to the kind of co-commissioning strategy, where the tick between, in terms of like signing off a project or commissioning a project, between myself and whoever the genre head is, that's happening just very, very smoothly. And then we have commissioners who sit in Scotland who can work together on those programmes. And that's across the genres, not just scripted, but across daytime, factual entertainment. The commissioner for Traitors, Neil McCallum, he sits in Scotland as well, and that's all filmed up in the north of Scotland. So we really do have a kind of a really good, close working relationship, that commissioning in Scotland, but for across the UK as well.
So it's really good to hear about the success of the BBC and the way the collaboration is reaching out internationally with programmes. But how is that benefiting Scotland? Are we getting more Scottish-focused production programmes, mainly for Scotland? You mentioned Bite Size and the success of Bite Size. I mean, how does that translate into more general audiences, given that it will be focused on a curriculum for schools? Is that a broad enough base for that, or is that something which focuses regionally more than...
Yeah, so I used to run Bite Size for Scotland. That was my first job in the BBC when I came back from London to live in Scotland. So the way Bite Size team is constructed, we have a team sitting in Scotland who create resources for the Scottish curriculum, for the Curriculum for Excellence, and that goes into a certain part of Bite Size. Now there are teams across the whole of the UK commissioning content for Bite Size. We also have a team in Gaelic language as well. There's a team in Wales, there's a team covering GCSEs, but they all form part of the one Bite Size team. They just happen to be in the different locales. And that's been very, very successful. Working when I took over Bite Size, it was very separate actually, and all the teams have commissioned and created their web pages in isolation. Now everyone works to one platform, one template. They share resources, they share budgets. So we're always trying to reduce duplication and make it as efficient as possible. And I think the last stat I read on Bite Size was 75% of young people use Bite Size, which is incredible. And I guess to your wider point about how does that impact Scotland, we obviously worry about young audiences and their relationship with the BBC, and Bite Size is where we know they have a strong relationship. It's a trust relationship, and that carries them through, hopefully, into other platforms like iPlayer and Sounds, which we can promote on Bite Size as well.
Is that 75% UK figure? Or is
I believe so, yes.
I think we over-index in Scotland. I think we're very focused on the Scottish curriculum, and as Louise says, we have this kind of base of services for efficiency reasons, but everything is absolutely tailored to Scottish kids, and we do really well in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just follow on slightly Susan's question, but also refer back a little bit to Stephen's as well. And Traitors has been mentioned a couple of times today, and of course it's been a huge hit for the BBC. But my understanding is that certainly series 1 and 2 are not recognised by Ofcom, or not classified, I suppose is a better word, by Ofcom as made in Scotland, because in order to qualify you have to tick 2 of 3 boxes, one about having a substantive base in Scotland, one about the budget being spent, or the proportion of the budget being spent in Scotland, and the other I think is about the production team, a percentage of the production team living in Scotland. So although Traitors is obviously filmed in Scotland, it's produced and edited in London. Is it not possible to do that work, the production and editing in Scotland, or if we don't already have the skills and talents, and I'd be surprised if we didn't, whether we couldn't upskill people in Scotland to allow them to be involved in the production all the way through?
Yeah, we absolutely do have the skills, you're right. I think what happens with programmes like Traitors, and I think that it does qualify as Scottish under the Ofcom, because there are 3 criteria, you're right, and we would like there to be at least 2 of them that qualify. That we would like to go above what the minimum is. But programmes develop, and as you know, we're in Series 3 now, and I think what's happened with Traitors, I'd have to get back to you on the exact figures, but that level of production in Scotland, that level of talent in Scotland has increased as it goes on. So that sense of upskilling, that sense of getting to a place, sometimes is a gradual thing. I talked a little bit earlier about Mentor, which I have a close relationship with, and you're right, it moved, and then gradually more and more of the Scottish talent came through, and we're able to make all of the aspects of Question Time here. And the same has happened with Traitors, that I think we've got more and more talent based in Scotland than perhaps in Series 1 and 2. But these things evolve over time.
It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how Series 3 is classified then going forward. Okay, I'll pass to Tom now.
Thank you very much. And I should begin by declaring some interest as the chair of the BBC APPG, a recipient of BBC Hospitality and a former employee of the Prospect and Bec2 unions, which represent BBC staff. So in December 2021, the BBC and Screen Scotland said that there was an urgent need to address skills shortages in the screen industry. Are skills shortages still limiting the growth of TV and film production in Scotland?
So, as we've said throughout this morning, the industry is changing and moving, and we have to make sure that we can keep up with that. So, for example, we have, I think the figure is 68 apprentices at the moment working in Scotland, and they're not all working in news or current affairs. We have news apprentices, we have production apprentices, we have engineering apprentices, we have HR apprentices. So across the whole spectrum, we have apprentices, and they're not all in Glasgow either. They're working across. We've got them in Shetland, we've got them in Inverness, Aberdeen, Glasgow, etc. So we spend a lot of money on skilling inside the BBC, but also outside the BBC. It's really important to us that the sector is able to deliver as the industry changes. So, for example, on some productions, I think Granite Harbour was one of them, wasn't it? That we will put in alongside the production a training programme. We will look at training, to make sure that people have the right skills, and we work really closely with Screen Scotland and other agencies to make sure that as we pivot towards high impact, as the model changes, as the kind of programmes that we're asking people to make for us change, that we make sure people have the skills to go with that.
Brilliant. And that answers one of my follow-ups, but I suppose also the across the UK strategy included a commitment to partner with local education providers, which I think you've just touched on, to grow the skills base needed to operate the BBC's production studios in places like Glasgow. Can you elaborate a bit further on the progress that's been made on that?
Sorry, tell me again, the partnership was?
To partner with local education providers to grow the skills base needed to operate the BBC's production in places like Glasgow.
So we do a number of things. We work closely with colleges and universities to make sure that they are, they know what it is that we need, and that their graduates can come and work with us. A number of our staff go and talk to college and university courses. I know I've been asked to do it in the past. I know a number of our colleagues will do that and go and talk to people about their careers, about what we need from people, about the skill set that they need. And so, I think that we've got really close relationships in Scotland with all of those providers, and try and keep that conversation going, because, as I say, it's ever evolving.
Yesterday at the DCMS committee, we heard a lot about how there'd been a big boom in content commissioning a few years ago that's now dried up a little from the major streamers, say, which has resulted in some independent production companies having to close, or there not being enough work being commissioned. How does that sit with the skills shortage as well? Because it's interesting that there's almost a surplus in some areas and a shortage in others, would you say? Or
yeah, let's not pretend that life is easy to be a production company or a freelance in our industry at the moment. We have financial challenges, but our competitors, are also challenged in various ways, and we know that a large number of people, for example, who work in our sector and freelancers are out of work. So we work very hard. I think in terms of licence fee spend, 75% of the money spent in Scotland is spent by the BBC. We can't work in isolation. We don't want to be the last man standing. We really want the sector to flourish, but with other parts of the industry contributing to that as well.
Thank you. And that, I guess, takes me on to streaming. And Louise, perhaps this is for you. How has the BBC's relationship with streaming companies like Amazon and Netflix changed in recent years, both in general and in Scotland specifically?
Yeah, I mean, we're all part of the ecosystem, aren't we? I mean, I think, what we do in the BBC is very different from what the streamers do. They have commercial model, we're a universal broadcaster, and we've seen, to Hayley's point, there's massive pressure on the sector at the moment. We're very aware of that. We're also very aware of the inflationary cost of production, and I mean, it has really increased massively over the past few years. But then against the sort of like the audience appetite for more high-end TV, so there's a sort of like a good balance to be struck, I think. How it's changed for us in Scotland is we're working increasingly in partnership with streamers and other broadcasters. Half Man that I've mentioned, that's in partnership with BBC Drama and HBO. Dinosaurs in partnership with BBC Comedy and Hulu. We've got a BBC Scotland drama commission with Sky New Zealand that's coming this year. I mean, we're just really we're just looking to the market for good partners and to find the right projects that we can all support. So I think there's a huge appetite to work more in collaboration. I think there's never been more appetite for content from Scotland. I was at an international market last year, and just the conversation around about what's coming out of Scotland and the exciting talents, which BBC and the streamers all contribute to. We're all kind of contributing into that kind of that excitement round about Scottish content. I think Margaret Mary's example of the island is an excellent one. That's absolutely a funding partnership, lots of partners coming together to make a bigger product rather than everybody sort of like commissioning smaller things individually.
And when you collaborate with the companies you mentioned and perhaps also the bigger streamers, do you think it's possible to retain a distinctly Scottish end product if you do work together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we bring to the table. It's not my commission, but it's Gaynor Holmes, who commissions for BBC Drama. She's commissioned our new Lockerbie drama with Netflix, and that's absolutely telling the authentic story of Lockerbie, but it will also go on the Netflix platform as well. So I mean, that is one of our key criteria for working with any partner, is that Scottish portrayal is at the heart of everything we do, and that's why if we put money on the table for a project, that's what we want from it.
When you compare yourselves against those other companies, what do you think is distinctive about what the BBC brings to the Scottish screen sector, both from an industry perspective and for audiences?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's for us it's a not sure if this is jargon or if it isn't, but authentic portrayal is sort of what we think about. Are the people in audiences in Scotland, when they watch this programme, will they recognise themselves in this programme? That's what we bring. And the commissioners in my team and our audience team and our marketing team, we're very close to our audiences. I think we're much closer to our audiences in our communities and in sensibility. That's what we look for as BBC commissioners, and that's what sets us apart. I think we have programmes that we've commissioned that feel very, very authentic though, but then have been bought by streamers like Netflix and Amazon. So we look for quality, but we look for authenticity. And I think if you get those two things right, then you're delivering for your audience in Scotland, but you can also, those indies can then sell those programmes across the world, which is obviously brilliant for them as a business too.
Thank you. And for Margaret Mary, have streaming companies shown any interest in content for Gaelic-speaking audiences?
Not yet. I'm sure they will.
That was brief.
Next Tuesday.
Fingers crossed.
Susan, did you want to follow up on that?
Just a very quick question about, you were talking about the availability of skills and working with the colleges and all of that. That's great, but how does the higher tax banding for income tax in Scotland affect the situation for production companies basing themselves in Scotland? Do you think that has an effect Do you think that some people prefer to work in partnership with you but be based elsewhere for that reason?
I mean, honestly, I've got no evidence of that. I think, broadly speaking, I was thinking about our news audience, our news team yesterday in particular, but we have really high quality people working in Scotland, and I think it's because Scotland is, not just the BBC, but Scotland as a whole is an amazing place to be. Back to your questions about across the UK, we haven't struggled to persuade people to come to Scotland. When people want to live and work in Scotland, it's a great quality of life, so I have no evidence of that.
Okay.
Harriet.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. We know that impartiality is prescribed in the BBC's charter, and it's really important, and no one's doubting BBC Scotland's or any of your individuals' commitment, sincere commitment to impartiality. But despite this, in the mid-term review, there was concerns of perceived impartiality throughout BBC, but particularly in the news content. At all times, and I guess especially, and it'll be on our minds in the next 18 months in the run-up to the Scottish Parliament elections, how are you addressing this, both in terms of, representation, as what people see, what people hear, and just how are you going to ensure that audiences are getting, one, that they think they're seeing the impartiality, but you're trying to deliver, but also that it is truly impartial?
Yeah, it's incredibly important to me that we are impartial and that audiences trust us. And I guess just a little bit of context, we are still by some distance the most trusted, news provider. So, but we're not complacent at all about this. We run impartiality training. Every journalist from new starts through to people who've been with us for years and years have impartiality training. We monitor impartiality. We piloted, and it's now being rolled out, impartiality champions across BBC Scotland. BBC Scotland was the pilot area. It was the idea of somebody in Scotland, and they will be now placed within teams and able to call stuff out if they think it's not quite working. And that's going to be rolled out across other parts of the BBC now. I have real faith in our journalists. I mean, I just think they work in occasionally a tricky environment, particularly in the political sphere, although it's not exclusively that. And we cover politics across the whole piece. Our journalists across the country will cover, as I said earlier, the impact of politics. So it all needs to feel like it's really, really impartial. And I think back to what I said earlier about a polarised society. We have our particular challenges in Scotland, but I think we have a brilliant team of journalists who I'm pretty confident can address them. And quite the opposite of looking at the next Scottish election and thinking that things are potentially going to be problematic. I really think that's when we prove ourselves. And I go back to that general election figure where our approval ratings went up between the two elections. It is absolutely possible to improve the way that people see us in terms of our impartiality scores, but I have real confidence in the way that we tackle impartiality. And it's across everything, isn't it? It's across, are we covering the whole country? Are we geographically based? Impartiality of viewpoints. Is every view represented is really important to us. And we ask the question, I've been in lots and lots of production meetings in my time, and we ask the question, what else is often the question? It's not just are we hitting the boxes, but what else do we need to do? And I go back to the audience, we may be saying we've got representation across the piece, but does the audience understand the wider picture at this point? What else do we have to do? And that explanation, analysis, in-depth journalism, often on our website, but across all of our output, is where we can really, really deliver on that.
Thank you. No, thank you. And just really briefly to follow up, how do you monitor or measure levels of either actual or more likely perceived impartiality? And is that all internal? Is there some external? And how, again, I guess to the public, do you display this? Because that's where, if we're to tackle perceived levels of impartiality, that needs to be the message that's coming across as well.
Yeah, as I say, we have our own internal mechanisms of measuring things, and quite frankly, people tell us, the audience really tells us what they think now. There are also, as you'll know, there are external surveys around levels of impartiality and perceived trust in various broadcasters. And as I say, we are not complacent, but we do, regularly come out, by far the most trusted broadcaster. And in a world where, I've got teenage daughters, it's that where they get their news from is a much wider range of sources than when I was at their age. I think it's really important in the modern world that they can feel that they can trust the BBC.
Thank you. Thanks.
We're going back to Angus now.
Yes, sorry about that. The Charter Review, do you see that this is an opportunity or a risk for BBC Scotland?
I think it's a massive opportunity. I mean, we're about across the BBC to embark on an engagement exercise with audiences, and Scottish audiences will play a major role in that. And, what we really want to do is have a conversation about what is our purpose and what do you want from us. And we will take our lead from what they tell us. So in terms of what does Scotland want to get out of the Charter renewal process, we will be led by what our audiences tell us. And it's a real opportunity to really, have a detailed discussion about what is our purpose, what do people want and need from us, and how can we deliver that. And clearly, we need to have a sustainable financial model in order to do that. So, we need everyone's support in that. We need the support of people in this room. What do you need from us in order to help us with that debate? What is the conversation going forward? But it's definitely an opportunity. But we do need the sustainable financial model.
I think making sure people like us are informed, and you can do it to the 650 MPs, I think would be very important for you guys, to lay out what's available, how we can help you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what do you need from us in order for us to, to ask for your help? And, whether it's come and visit us, whether it's come into our studio, see how things are done, have a look at things firsthand, whatever it is you need from us, we're very happy to help.
The other way around, if I were you, I would do a memo about what you think you are delivering and how we can help you. Yeah. You were not as informed as you are, obviously.
Yeah, and again, events like this, I think, is that level of understanding of what it is that we're doing and some of the content that we can talk about. Absolutely. Thank you.
Going forward to the Charter Review, is there anything in particular, or is there one thing that the UK government could do to help the BBC and BBC Scotland particularly?
Again, we are about to do this engagement survey, engagement exercise rather, across the whole of the UK, but I say Scottish audiences at the heart of it for us, and we will very much be led by them as to what they say. So I'd really relish the opportunity to come back and talk to you a bit more once we've done that. But clearly, back to your questions around the Across the UK strategy and what that looks like, we are open for business. We want the BBC to be, represented in Scotland and to represent Scottish audiences as much as it can. And we think it's a brilliant part of the BBC to work in. So that sense of, what can we deliver out of Scotland? There are, as far as I'm concerned, I've got huge ambitions. There are no limits to what we can deliver in Scotland. We have brilliant resourcing, particularly in Glasgow, but across Scotland in terms of studio space, in terms of the facilities that we can offer. So we can take more things in Scotland and we can really develop the creative sector through that. But as I say, I will wait to see what the audience wants, because that's what matters to us most.
That sounds like a good note to end on. Thank you very much for that. I think it's fair to say over the years this committee has had an ongoing dialogue with BBC Scotland, and I think it's something we'd want to maintain going forward. So it's been very helpful and very informative today, but we're also very grateful, Margaret, Mary, to your colleagues in Stornoway. We had a very interesting visit with them, and they did do their very best to promote the island. So we will watch that one and other output from the channel with real interest going forward. So thank you all very much for that, and thank you very much for your time too.
Thank you.